The blood trail ended at his front door, and in the silence of the Montana plains, Thomas McKinnon knew he had a choice to make. He pressed his ear against the rough-hewn wood of his cabin, the silence outside so deep it felt like a sound itself. For 3 long years he'd built this life of solitude, a life of peace, a life where the only ghosts were his own. But ghosts have a way of finding you. He'd seen the wounded girl crumpled by his water trough at dawn. Buckskin clothes, intricate beadwork, and a stain of crimson spreading across her shoulder, dark as a secret. He knew who she was, he knew where she came from, and he knew helping her was a death sentence. He'd brought her inside anyway. Clean the wound. He was a former cavalry scout. He knew a knife wound when he saw one. It was deep, angry. Someone had tried to end her and failed. For now. Her name was Ayanna. Her English was crisp, learned at a mission school. When he'd asked who did this to her, her answer chilled him to the bone. My own people, she'd whispered, her dark eyes scanning the windows, watching the horizon. They say I have betrayed our ways. It was a story that made a certain kind of sense. Tensions were high. The government was pushing, and the tribes were pushing back. Some wanted peace. Others wanted war. A girl caught between those two worlds, it was a dangerous place to be. But something about it felt wrong. Thomas had spent years in this territory. He knew the tribes. He knew their customs. They were proud people. But this kind of violence, against one of their own, a chief's daughter by the look of her, it didn't track. Not for this reason. He bandaged her shoulder, the silence in the small cabin stretching thin. He could feel her watching him, studying his every move. He was a white man, an outsider. In her world, he was the enemy. Yet here she was, accepting his help. Or was she? As he tied off the final knot on the bandage, his fingers brushed against the buckskin of her sleeve. And that's when he felt it. Tucked inside, stitched into the lining, was a small, hard object. It was thin, rectangular. He pulled his hand back like he'd been burned. He knew that shape. He'd carried one just like it for years. It was a military dog tag. His blood ran cold. That wasn't a tribal custom. That was something from his world. From the world he'd run away from. The world of uniforms and orders. And blood. He looked at her again. Really looked at her. The fear in her eyes was real. But underneath it, there was something else. A flicker of calculation. A secret she was holding so tight it was suffocating her. The story she told him was a lie, and Thomas had a sickening feeling that he'd just invited the real monster right into his home. What would you do in his shoes? Would you throw her out? Or would you try to uncover the truth, knowing it could get you killed? Let me know in the comments below. He didn't confront her, not yet. To show his hand now would be a fool's move. If she was running from something worse than her own people, he needed to know what it was. Knowledge was the only currency that mattered out here. So he played along. He gave her the cot and made himself a bed on the floor. He listened to her story about wanting to bridge two worlds, about the council of elders who feared the white man's ways. It was a good story, a believable story, and every word of it was a carefully constructed cage. But every time she thought he wasn't looking, he saw her gaze drift to the horizon, not with the fear of a hunted animal, but with the tense patience of a hunter waiting for their prey. He went about his chores the next day, his senses on high alert. The creak of the windmill, the lowing of his cattle, every sound was a potential threat. He kept his Colt, .45 strapped to his hip, the weight of it a cold comfort. He was a rancher now, but the scout inside him, the soldier, was wide awake. And the soldier was telling him he was in terrible danger. He found his proof in the barn. While she was inside resting, he went back to the spot where he'd found her. The ground was disturbed, the dust telling a story. He followed the faint scuffs, the bent blades of grass leading away from the water trough. And there, half buried under a loose pile of hay, he found it. A single spent cartridge casing. He picked it up, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a .44 Henry, a rifle round, the kind used by the U.S. cavalry. His mind raced. The knife wound was real, but it wasn't the whole story. Someone had shot at her. Someone with a military rifle, and they had missed. The knife wound was likely from a close-quarter struggle after the shot. This changed everything. Her people didn't carry Henry rifles. They had older muskets, bows, maybe a few traded Winchesters. But this casing, this was a soldier's weapon. The lie wasn't just a lie, it was a misdirection. She wasn't running from her family. She was running from the United States Army, or someone who wanted to look like them. He walked back to the house, the brass casing clutched in his fist. The sun was climbing, burning away the morning mist. He opened the door and found her standing by the window, her back to him, staring out at the plains. "They're coming," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He looked over her shoulder. At first he saw nothing, just the endless sea of grass. Then a flicker of movement, a dark line on the horizon. Riders, at least a dozen of them. They weren't riding like a search party. They were riding like a war party. "Your people?" he asked, his voice low, testing her. She turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw the mask drop. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve that looked terrifyingly at home on her young face. "No," she said, her eyes boring into his. "Your people." The riders grew closer, their forms taking shape against the rising sun. They were warriors painted for war, feathers in their hair, rifles held across their saddles. But they weren't his people, not by a long shot. They were Ayana's. At their head rode a man who sat his horse like a king. He was tall, powerful, his face a mask of grim determination. He radiated an authority that left no room for doubt. This was the leader. Ayana stepped onto the porch, and Thomas moved to stand beside her. He didn't know what game was being played, but he was a piece on the board now, whether he liked it or not. The lead rider pulled his horse to a halt just feet from the porch. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over Thomas, dismissing him as irrelevant. Then they landed on Ayana. "Sister," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. This wasn't just a war chief. This was her brother. "Takakota," she replied, her chin held high. There was no warmth in her tone, only the cold formality of two opposing generals meeting on the field of battle. So she had lied about everything. Her family wasn't trying to kill her. They were here for her. But why? Why the elaborate deception? Why the story about betrayal? Takakota dismounted, his movements fluid and precise. He walked towards the porch, his warriors staying mounted, their hands never straying far from their weapons. The message was clear. This was not a social call. "You have caused our father great worry," Takakota said, his English as perfect as his sister's. "Father worries about the wrong things," Ayana shot back. "He worries about tradition when our lands are being stolen." The argument felt rehearsed, an old song they had sung many times, but there was a new, sharper edge to it now. Takakota's gaze flickered to the bandage on Ayana's shoulder, and then to Thomas. A dangerous question was forming in his eyes. "Who did this to you?" he demanded. Ayana hesitated for a fraction of a second. She glanced at Thomas, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes. And in that moment, Thomas understood. This was the real test. Her story had to hold. "Settlers," Thomas said, his voice steady, stepping forward slightly, "found her by the creek. They ran when they saw me." It was a weak lie, and he knew it. But it was the only one they had. Takakota's eyes narrowed. He was no fool. He could see the holes in the story. He took a step closer, his focus entirely on Thomas now. He wasn't just a warrior, he was an interrogator. "And you," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "the lonely rancher. Why would you help a daughter of the people who likely burned your last homestead?" Thomas froze. His heart stopped. No one knew about that. No one was supposed to know. He'd come here 3 years ago, bought this land, and told everyone he was from back east. He'd buried his past so deep, he'd almost convinced himself it was gone. The massacre at Willow Creek, the fire, the screams, the faces of the cavalrymen as they rode through the village, killing without mercy. The face of their commander, a man with cold, dead eyes. A man named Colonel Redding, and Thomas. Thomas had been there. He'd been a scout. He had led them there. He hadn't known what Redding planned, not until it was too late. He'd tried to stop it, and in return, Redding had branded him a traitor, a deserter. He'd barely escaped with his life, leaving everything he was behind in the ashes. How could Takakota possibly know? Unless, unless Ayana's tribe was the one from Willow Creek. He looked from Takakota's accusing eyes to Ayana's terrified face. The puzzle pieces slammed together with brutal force. She hadn't just stumbled upon his ranch by accident. She had been sent here. She had sought him out. This wasn't a rescue. It was a trap. And he had walked right into it. Takakota saw the recognition dawn on Thomas's face, and a cruel, satisfied smile touched his lips. The pretense was over. "You are Thomas McKinnon," Takakota stated, the name in indictment. "Scout for the 7th Cavalry, the man who led Colonel Redding to our winter camp." Every word was a nail in his coffin. The peaceful life he'd built was a fantasy, and the nightmare had just begun. His hand instinctively went to his hip, but the warriors behind Takakota had already raised their rifles. He was outmanned, outgunned, and outmaneuvered. "I didn't know what he was going to do," Thomas said, his voice barely a whisper. The old excuse tasted like ash in his mouth. "You led him there," Takakota spat. "Our women, our children, they paid the price for your ignorance." He turned his furious gaze back to his sister. "And you were supposed to bring him to us, to face the council's justice, not to hide in his house like a frightened mouse. So that was the plan. Ayana was the bait. Her injury, the story, all of it was a lie designed to get her close to him, to lure him into a position where her brother could take him. Justice for a crime he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. But then, Ayana did something unexpected. She stepped between them. "The plan was wrong, brother," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Vengeance will not bring back the dead, and he is not the one who gave the orders." "He is a loose end," Takakota countered, his rage barely contained. "As long as he lives, Redding's story holds, that our camp was a hostile gathering, that the attack was justified. Colonel Redding, the butcher of Willow Creek, he was still out there, and apparently he was powerful enough that his word was law. Thomas's testimony was the only thing that could challenge it." "What does Redding have to do with this?" Thomas demanded. "That was 3 years ago." "Redding is no longer a colonel," Ayana explained, her eyes pleading with him to understand. "He was rewarded for his bravery. The government gave him this entire valley. He's a land baron now. He's been forcing our people onto a reservation, piece by piece. He uses the massacre as proof that we cannot be trusted." The wound on her shoulder suddenly made a different kind of sense. "It wasn't settlers who attacked you," Thomas said, looking at her. "It wasn't my lie. It was Redding's men, wasn't it? That's why you had the cavalry casing." She nodded, shamefaced. "I was searching for proof, a ledger, something to connect Redding to the illegal land grabs. His men found me near his ranch. I was shot. I escaped." "And you ran here," Thomas finished, the betrayal stinging him. "Because your brother thought I was an easy target, a way to get a confession and clear your tribe's name." "It was a desperate plan," Takakota admitted, his anger giving way to a grudging frustration. "But Redding is untouchable. He has money, influence. Your testimony is the only weapon we have left." "So you'd sacrifice your own sister?" Thomas asked, a new kind of anger rising in him, an anger on Ayana's behalf. "I would do what is necessary for the survival of my people," Takakota said coldly. He looked at Ayana, his face hardening once more. "You have failed. You have chosen to protect the man who led our enemies to our door." He raised his hand, a signal to his warriors. "If you will not bring him to us, then you are no longer one of us. You have chosen exile." He was disowning her, right here, right now, casting her out. "Brother, please," Ayana begged. "You have made your choice," Takakota said, his voice like stone. He turned to mount his horse, his back to her. "She is no longer under our protection. She is dead to us." He paused, his hand on the saddle, and looked back at Thomas. A final, chilling warning. "Colonel Redding knows his scout is still alive. He's been hunting you for 3 years. Now his men have seen his star witness with you. He will not stop until you are both silenced permanently." He swung himself onto his horse. "Winter comes early to this country, McKinnon. he said, his voice low and menacing, and the wolves are hungry. With that, he and his warriors turned and rode away, leaving Thomas and Ayanna alone in the dust. The silence rushing back in, heavier and more terrifying than before. They weren't just a rancher and a runaway anymore. They were two ghosts, haunted by the same monster, and the monster was coming for them. The weight of Takakota's words settled over the ranch like a shroud. They were alone, utterly and completely. Ayanna's people had cast her out, and Thomas's past had finally cornered him. Redding. The name echoed in his mind, a harbinger of violence. He looked at Ayanna. The fierce, defiant girl had vanished, replaced by someone lost and broken. She had gambled everything on a desperate plan, and now she had nothing. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" he asked, his voice rough. "Would you have believed me?" She countered, her voice hollow. "A woman from the tribe you saw destroyed? Would you have helped me if you knew I was sent to trap you?" He didn't have an answer for that. Probably not. "The dog tag," he said, changing the subject. "Where did you get it?" "It belonged to a soldier," she whispered. "One of Redding's men. He was at Willow Creek. He died last winter. Before he did, he talked. He felt guilty. He told my father everything about Redding's illegal gold prospecting on our sacred land. The massacre was never about a hostile threat. It was to clear the land so he could mine it in secret. So that was it, the motive. It was never about war. It was about greed. The ledger you were looking for, it would prove it," she finished. "It details his shipments, his buyers. It would ruin him." They stood in silence on the porch, the vast, empty prairie stretching out before them. It no longer looked like a place of peace. It looked like a killing field. "We can't stay here," Thomas said, his mind already shifting back into scout mode, analyzing threats, planning escape routes. "Redding knows where I am. He knows you're with me. He'll send more than a couple of thugs next time. He'll send an army." "Where can we go?" Ayanna asked, a tremor of fear in her voice. "My people will not take me in. And you're a wanted deserter." She was right. They were trapped. To run would be to die tired. Redding had money and men. He could hunt them across the entire territory. Their only chance, their slimmest hope, was to fight. But not here. This ranch was a death trap, a wooden box in the middle of a flat plain. "There's a place," Thomas said, a memory surfacing. "A canyon, about 2 days' ride from here. Box Canyon. Only one way in or out. Good water, defensible. We could hold out there for a while, at least long enough to figure out a plan." A flicker of hope returned to Ayanna's eyes. "A plan to do what?" "To finish what you started," he said, the words surprising him as they came out. "We're not going to run. We're going to get that ledger. We're going to destroy Redding." It was insane. Two people against a powerful land baron with a private army. But what other choice did they have? Waiting to be slaughtered wasn't a choice. "We'll need supplies," Thomas said, his voice taking on a new urgency. "Food, water, ammunition. Every bullet we have." They worked with a frantic energy, a shared purpose pushing back the fear. They loaded his 2 pack mules with everything they could carry. Sacks of flour, salted pork, coffee. He emptied his ammunition stores, boxes of cartridges for his Winchester and his Colt. As he worked, he watched Ayanna. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her earlier despair replaced by a grim focus. She was a survivor. He'd seen that from the moment he'd found her. She had been raised in a hard world, and it had made her strong, stronger than she knew. They were almost ready to leave when she stopped, holding up a small leather pouch. "There is something else," she said. "My brother, he did not leave us with nothing." Thomas looked at her confused. "He disowned you." "Publicly, yes," she said, a complex emotion in her eyes, a mix of love and bitterness. "It was for Redding's spies, to make them believe I am truly alone, unprotected. But he left this for me by the fence post as they rode away." She opened the pouch. Inside was a detailed map, drawn on a piece of cured hide. It was a layout of Redding's ranch. It showed guard patrols, watchtower locations, and a detailed drawing of the main house. And there in the center of the house, a room was marked with a symbol for a safe. He still wanted you to succeed, Thomas breathed, a new respect for the complicated warrior chief dawning on him. He couldn't help you openly, but he gave you a weapon. My brother is a man of honor, Ayanna said quietly, but his duty is to our people, not to me. He believes this is my fight now, ours. The map changed the equation. It wasn't a suicide mission anymore. It was a heist, a dangerous, near impossible heist, but it was a plan. There's one more thing we need, Thomas said, looking at the map. This is a fortress. We can't just walk in. We need a distraction, a big one. He looked out at his own ranch, the small house, the barn, the fences he had so carefully built over 3 years. Everything he owned, everything he had worked for. A sad, resolute smile touched his lips. And I think I know just the thing. They left at dusk, riding hard for the mountains, the two pack mules trailing behind. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. An hour later, as they reached the foothills, a bright orange glow lit up the horizon behind them. Thomas McKinnon's ranch was burning. The fire would be seen for miles. It would draw Redding's men out, a perfect distraction. By the time they figured out it was a decoy, Thomas and Ayanna would be long gone, hidden in the labyrinth of canyons to the west. He had burned his old life to the ground, literally. There was no going back now. The only way was forward. For 2 days they rode through the rugged, unforgiving terrain. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of strangers, but the focused silence of comrades. They were a team, bound by a shared enemy and a slim chance of survival. Thomas found himself watching her, impressed by her resilience. She never complained. She treated her own wound, her movements sure and practiced. She could read the land as well as he could, pointing out sources of water he might have missed, identifying edible plants. She was not the helpless victim she had pretended to be. She was a warrior in her own right, and he found himself feeling something more than just respect, a fierce protectiveness, a connection that went deeper than their shared predicament. They reached the box canyon on the third day. It was just as he remembered it, a narrow entrance easily defended, opening up into a small, hidden valley with a clear stream and good grazing for the horses. It was a perfect sanctuary, a place to regroup, a place to plan their attack. They made a small, smokeless fire that night, the canyon walls rising around them like ancient protectors. Redding will be furious when he realizes we're gone, Ayanna said, staring into the flames. He'll tear this territory apart looking for us. Let him, Thomas said. The more men he has out searching, the fewer he'll have guarding his ranch. We just need to choose our moment. They studied the map Takakota had left, the firelight flickering across the lines and symbols. The plan was simple in its design, but terrifying in its execution. They would use the chaos of the search to their advantage, slipping into the ranch while Redding's forces were spread thin. But there was a problem, a big one. Even with a distraction, we can't both go, Thomas said, tracing the map with his finger. The safe is in his office. It will take time to crack. One of us has to create a diversion on the ranch itself to draw the remaining guards away from the house. I'll do it, Ayanna said immediately. No, Thomas countered. It's too dangerous. You're still wounded. My wound is healing, she said, her eyes flashing with defiance. And I know his ranch better than you. I scouted it for weeks. I know the routines, the blind spots. You are the soldier. You know how to handle a safe, how to fight your way out if you have to. I am the scout. I know how to move unseen. She was right. It made tactical sense. But the thought of her out there alone, a decoy for Redding's killers, filled him with a cold dread. Ayanna, this is not just your fight, Thomas, she said, her voice softening. He destroyed my family. He is destroying my people. I have to do this. For them. He looked at her, at the firelight dancing in her determined eyes, and he knew he couldn't argue. They were partners in this, equals. All right, he said, his voice heavy, but we do this on one condition. What is it? He hesitated, the words feeling strange and momentous in the quiet canyon. This is likely a one-way trip for both of us. The chances of us walking away from this are slim. If we're going to die, I don't want to die as strangers. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small tarnished silver ring he'd carried for years. It had belonged to his mother. I know this is crazy, he said, his voice low. And the timing is, well, it's insane. But what we're doing, it's more than just a partnership. We're trusting each other with our lives. In my world, there's a name for that. He held out the ring. Marry me, Ayana, he said. Not for love, not for a future we probably don't have, but for right now, so that when we face him together, as one. Her eyes widened, shock giving way to a cascade of emotions he couldn't read. She looked from the ring to his face, searching for something. The proposal was madness, a desperate act in a desperate time. But in the strange, violent world they now inhabited, it was the only thing that made sense. A final pact, a bond forged in fire and sealed with a promise. What would she say? Would she see it as a declaration of trust, or the ramblings of a man who knew he was about to die? Ayana stared at the small silver ring in his palm, the firelight making it gleam. She didn't speak for a long time. The only sound the crackling of the fire and the gentle murmur of the stream. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. He'd laid his soul bare, and he had no idea how she would react. Finally she looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. There were no tears, no grand emotion, just a quiet, profound seriousness. In my culture, she began, her voice soft, a bond like this is not sealed with a ring, it is sealed with a shared truth. She took a deep breath. The day of the massacre at Willow Creek, I was there. I was a little girl. I saw you. You were leading the soldiers. I remember your face. For years I hated that face. You were the monster in my nightmares. Thomas felt the air leave his lungs. He wanted to look away, but her gaze held him fast. But I also saw what happened next, she continued. I saw you argue with the colonel. I saw you try to stop him, and I saw him strike you down. When the village was burning and my mother was hiding me in the riverbank, I saw you carrying one of our wounded children away from the flames. You tried to save him. Redding's men shot at you. You were a traitor to them, too. She had seen it all, the whole ugly truth of his failure and his one small act of defiance. My brother's plan was to use you for your testimony, she said. But my plan was to find the man who carried that child, to see if there was any good left in him, to see if he was worth saving. She reached out and gently closed his hand around the silver ring. You are, she whispered. So yes, Thomas McKinnon, I will marry you, not for right now, but for whatever future we can carve out of the darkness. In the quiet of that hidden canyon, with no witnesses but the stars above, they made their vow. It was a promise that went deeper than words, a silent understanding that their lives were now intertwined, for better or for worse, until the very end. They spent the next week planning, going over every detail of the map, timing the guard patrols, planning for every contingency they could imagine. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was overshadowed by a powerful sense of purpose. A fragile, defiant hope began to grow between them. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their past, their dreams, the lives they had lived before their worlds had collided. He learned about her love for her people, her frustration with their adherence to traditions that she felt were holding them back in a changing world. She learned about his disillusionment with the army, his disgust with the blind greed and cruelty he had witnessed, and his deep-seated desire for a peace he had never been able to find. In that canyon, they were no longer a white man and an Indian woman. They were just Thomas and Ayana, two people who had found each other in the ruins of their lives. A slow, tentative affection grew, born not of passion, but of a profound, shared understanding. It was a love forged in the crucible of survival. The day they chose for the attack was moonless and starless, the sky covered by a thick blanket of clouds. It was perfect. They rode in silence, their horses' hooves muffled by rags. As they neared the Redding Ranch, the sheer scale of his operation became clear. It wasn't a ranch, it was a fortress. High walls, armed guards, and watchtowers, The main house lit up like a beacon in the dark. They tethered their horses in a thicket of trees a mile away and approached the final stretch on foot, moving like shadows through the tall grass. "This is it," Thomas whispered, his hand finding hers in the darkness. Her grip was firm, her hand steady. "I will create the diversion at the stables on the north side," she whispered back. "It's the furthest point from the house. I will use fire. It will be big. It should draw most of the guards." "Once the commotion starts, I go in," he confirmed. "Find the office, crack the safe, get the ledger." "And then?" she asked, her voice tight. "Rendezvous back at the horses, and we run like hell." It was a simple plan, and they both knew it had 100 ways to go wrong. "Ayana," he said, turning to face her, "be careful." "You too, my husband," she replied, a faint smile on her lips. She leaned in and kissed him, a quick, desperate press of her lips against his. It was their first kiss, and it felt like it could be their last. Then she was gone, melting into the darkness. Thomas's heart was a drum against his ribs. He crept towards the main house, finding a position in the shadows of a large oak tree, his Winchester ready. He watched the house, watched the guards, and he waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Every nerve in his body screamed. Had she been caught? Had something gone wrong? And then he saw it, a flicker of orange against the dark wood of the stables. It grew fast. A small flame became a raging inferno. Shouts erupted from across the compound. Bells started ringing. Guards came running from the barracks, from the house, all of them sprinting toward the fire. It was a perfect diversion. Ayana had done her part. Now it was his turn. With the guards' attention focused on the fire, the area around the main house was almost deserted. Thomas moved from the shadows, running low and fast, his boots silent on the dusty ground. He reached the back of the house, where a large window led into what the map marked as the library. Using the butt of his pistol, he smashed a single pane of glass, just enough to reach in and undo the latch. He slipped inside, the sound of his own breathing deafening in the silent, opulent room. The house smelled of leather, whiskey, and money. It was the smell of power. He moved quickly, following the map from memory. Through the library, down a long hall lined with hunting trophies, to a heavy oak door. Redding's office. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was dominated by a massive desk, and behind it, a large black iron safe was built into the stone wall. He went to work immediately. He was no expert safe cracker, but in his army days he'd learned a thing or two about explosives. He used a small amount of blasting powder, carefully packed into the seams around the safe door, with a short fuse. It wouldn't be quiet, but it would be fast. He lit the fuse and took cover behind the desk. The explosion was a deafening roar, shaking the entire house. Splinters of wood and chunks of plaster rained down from the ceiling. When the dust settled, the safe door was hanging crookedly on one hinge. He rushed forward and pulled it open. Inside were stacks of cash, deeds to land, and a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. He grabbed it. He had it. But as he turned to leave, a voice from the doorway stopped him cold. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up, McKinnon." Thomas spun around, his Winchester snapping up. Leaning against the doorframe, a pistol in his hand, was Colonel Redding. He was older, heavier, but his eyes were the same. Cold, dead. The eyes of a man with no soul, and he wasn't alone. Standing on either side of him were two of his men, rifles leveled at Thomas's chest. It had been a trap, the unlocked door. Redding waiting here. They had been expecting him. "The fire was a nice touch," Redding said with a lazy smile, "but a little predictable. Did you really think I wouldn't have men watching the house?" Thomas's mind raced. Where was Ayana? Had they caught her? As if reading his thoughts, Redding chuckled. "Don't worry about the girl. My men are tracking her as we speak. You see, after she escaped my boys the first time, I knew she'd come back, and I knew she wouldn't be alone. I've been waiting for you to crawl out of whatever hole you've been hiding in." He took a step into the room. "Give me the ledger, Thomas, and I'll make your death quick, a courtesy I don't plan on extending to your wife." The word wife dripped from his lips like poison. The threat was clear. Thomas looked at the ledger in his hand. the proof that could destroy this man. Then he looked at the three guns pointed at him. There was no way out. He had failed. He thought of Ayanna, out there in the darkness, being hunted. He thought of their vow, of the future they had dared to dream of. And a cold, pure rage burned away his fear. If he was going to die, he wasn't going to die alone. He made his decision in a heartbeat. He wasn't going to give Redding the ledger. He was going to give him hell. With a yell, Thomas threw the heavy ledger with all his might, not at Redding, but at the large oil lamp sitting on the corner of the desk. The glass shattered. Oil and flames exploded across the room, instantly igniting the dry papers on the desk, the heavy curtains. The room became an inferno. In the split second of shock and confusion, Thomas dove to the floor, rolling behind the desk as the guards' rifles roared, their bullets splintering the wood where he had just been standing. Smoke filled the room, thick and black. He came up coughing, his Winchester in his hands, and fired 2 quick shots through the smoke in the direction of the door. One of the guards screamed and fell. "Kill him!" Redding roared, his voice choked with smoke and fury. Thomas scrambled away from the desk, using the chaos as cover. He fired again, and the second guard went down. Now it was just him and Redding. Through the swirling smoke and flames, he saw Redding aiming his pistol. Thomas fired his last shot at the same moment Redding did. A white-hot poker of pain seared through Thomas's side. He stumbled back, hitting the wall, his rifle clattering to the floor. He was hit. Bad. But his own shot had found its mark. Redding stood there for a second, a look of stunned surprise on his face. A dark stain was spreading across the front of his expensive white shirt. He looked down at it, then back up at Thomas. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. Then he collapsed, his dead eyes staring up into the fire that was now consuming his empire. Thomas slid down the wall, pressing his hand to the wound in his side. It was bleeding badly. The fire was spreading with terrifying speed, the heat becoming unbearable. He had to get out. He had to get to Ayanna. He staggered to his feet, grabbing the fallen ledger from the floor. He stumbled out of the office, into the hallway, which was now thick with smoke. He could hear shouting outside, the alarm spreading. He had to get out before the whole house came down, before more guards arrived. He fought his way through the smoke-filled maze, his sides screaming in protest with every step. He finally found the back window he'd entered through and tumbled out into the night air, gasping for breath. The entire ranch was in chaos. Men were running everywhere, some fighting the fire at the stables, others now converging on the burning main house. He had to get to the rendezvous point. He had to know if Ayanna was safe. Clutching the ledger to his chest and his hand to his bleeding side, he forced himself into a painful, stumbling run, disappearing into the darkness just as the roof of the main house collapsed in a shower of sparks and flames. He reached the thicket where they'd left the horses, his vision starting to blur, his legs threatening to give out. The horses were still there, shifting nervously, but Ayanna was not. A wave of despair washed over him. Redding's men. They had her. He had won, but he had lost her. The thought was more painful than the bullet in his side. He leaned against a tree, his strength fading fast. He had the proof. He had destroyed Redding. But what did it matter without her? And then he heard a sound, a twig snapping in the darkness behind him. He spun around, trying to raise his pistol, but his arm was too heavy. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed for war. It was Takakota. And he was not alone. Behind him, more warriors emerged from the darkness, their faces grim, their weapons ready. They had him surrounded. Thomas's blood ran cold. Of course, Takakota had followed them. He had waited, letting Thomas do the dirty work, letting him risk his life to get the ledger. And now he was here to finish the job, to take the ledger and kill the last witness to his people's shame. "Where is she?" Thomas snarled, his voice a ragged whisper. "What have you done with your sister?" Takakota looked at him, his face unreadable in the dim light. He didn't answer. He simply raised his hand. From the trees behind him, 2 warriors stepped forward, dragging someone between them. It was Ayanna. She was bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. Thomas's world collapsed. He had been a fool, a pawn in a game far more complex and cruel than he had ever imagined. Takakota hadn't been helping them. He had been using them. He had used his own sister as bait, sacrificed her to get what he wanted. "You son of a bitch," Thomas breathed, all the fight draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, crushing defeat. Takakota stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the ledger clutched in Thomas's hand. "The price of justice is high, McKinnon," he said, his voice cold as the grave. "Give it to me, and I will grant you the mercy of joining your wife in the afterlife." This was it, the final betrayal. There was no escape, no hope, just the end of the line, in the darkness, at the hands of the man he had almost dared to respect. Ayana struggled against her captors, muffled screams coming from behind her gag. Her eyes, filled with tears of fury and despair, were locked on Thomas. Thomas looked from her face to her brother's. He saw no mercy there, only the relentless, single-minded pursuit of a goal. Vengeance. He was bleeding out. He was surrounded, and the woman he loved was about to be executed in front of him. But as he looked closer at Takakota's face, he saw something else, a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't triumph. It was anguish, a deep, profound pain. And behind him, Ayana wasn't just struggling. She was trying to tell him something, with her eyes. She kept glancing from Thomas to the warriors holding her, and then back again. A frantic, desperate message. Something was wrong with this picture. The warriors holding Ayana, they weren't painted like Takakota's men. Their markings were different, and the weapons they carried, they were cavalry pistols. And then a new voice cut through the darkness, a voice that made Thomas's blood freeze in his veins. "Thank you for flushing him out for us, Chief. Your cooperation will be noted." A man stepped out from behind a tree. He was wearing the uniform of a United States Marshal, but his face was one Thomas knew. It was Captain Evans, Redding's second in command, the man who had been at his side during the Willow Creek massacre. Takakota had been captured. This wasn't his betrayal. This was his trap. Evans smiled a predator's grin. "Redding is dead. That makes me the new boss in this valley, and my first order of business is cleaning up loose ends." He gestured with his pistol towards Thomas. "Starting with you." He then turned to Takakota. "As for you, once McKinnon is dead, your use to me is over. My report will say you and your war party attacked the ranch, and we stopped you. A neat and tidy end to our little arrangement." Takakota had made a deal with the devil to get close to Redding's operation, and the devil had double-crossed him. "The ledger," Evans snapped at Thomas. "Hand it over. Now." Thomas looked at the ledger, then at Ayana, then at the wounded, proud chief who had been played for a fool. He was still going to die. They all were. But maybe, just maybe, he could choose how. He held up the ledger. "You want it," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Come and get it." And with his last ounce of strength, he threw the ledger not at Evans, but deep into the dark woods behind him. For a single fatal second, every eye, including Evans, followed the arc of the flying book, and in that second, everything happened at once. Takakota, with a roar that was pure animal rage, slammed his head back into the face of the guard behind him. At the same instant, Ayana stomped down hard on the foot of one of her captors and drove her elbow into the gut of the other. It was the opening they needed. Thomas, ignoring the fire in his side, drew his Colt and fired at Evans. The shot went wide, but it made the marshal dive for cover. Takakota snatched a knife from the belt of his fallen guard and threw himself at the men who had been holding Ayana, a whirlwind of controlled, lethal fury. The two men, caught by surprise, went down in a spray of blood before they could even raise their pistols. The forest erupted into a symphony of chaos. Gunshots, war cries, the screams of dying men. Takakota's warriors, who had been held at gunpoint, were suddenly free and fighting with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. Ayana ran to Thomas's side, her face a mask of fierce determination. She ripped a piece of cloth from her dress and pressed it hard against his wound. "Stay with me, Thomas," she commanded. The battle was short and brutal. Evans and his men were outnumbered and outfought. They had relied on the element of surprise and betrayal, and when that was gone, they were no match for the warriors' skill. In the end, only Evans was left, scrambling in the underbrush for the ledger. Takakota stalked towards him, his face terrible to behold. He picked up the ledger and tucked it safely into his belt. "It's over, Evans," Takakota said, his voice low and deadly. Evans raised his pistol, his hands shaking. "Stay back, savage!" He never got the shot off. An arrow, silent and swift, sprouted from his chest. He looked down at it in disbelief before collapsing into the dirt. Ayana stood 20 feet away, a bow in her hand, her expression as cold and hard as flint. She had found a weapon from one of the fallen warriors and ended the fight herself. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the groans of the wounded. It was over. They had won. Takakota walked over to where Ayana was tending to Thomas. Thomas was fading fast, the world turning gray at the edges. The chief knelt beside him. He looked at his sister, then at the dying white man she was trying desperately to save. A long, complex look passed between them. "He fought with honor," Takakota said, his voice stripped of all its earlier arrogance. It was just the quiet statement of a fact. He placed a hand on Ayana's shoulder. "Our father was wrong, and I was blind. You did not betray our ways. You forged a new one, the path of a survivor." He looked at Thomas again, and for the first time, Thomas saw not an enemy, but a man. A leader burdened by the weight of his people's future. "You saved my sister's life," Takakota said, "and you have given us back our truth." He held up the ledger. "For that, my people are in your debt." Thomas tried to speak, but only a cough came out. Darkness was closing in. The last thing he saw was Ayana's face, her eyes pleading with him, her lips forming his name. Then everything went black. He woke to the smell of herbs and smoke. He was lying on a soft buffalo robe, the dim light of a fire flickering against the walls of a teepee. His side was tightly bandaged, the pain a dull, manageable ache instead of a searing fire. Ayana was sitting beside him, grinding herbs in a small stone bowl. When she saw his eyes open, she let out a small cry of relief and rushed to his side. "You're awake," she whispered, her hand finding his. "Where?" he managed to ask, his throat dry. "You are in my family's camp," a deep voice answered. Takakota stepped into the teepee, his face solemn. "Our healers have been tending to you. You have been asleep for 3 days." Thomas struggled to sit up, and Takakota helped him, propping him up against a backrest. "The ledger?" Thomas asked. "It has been sent to the territorial governor, along with the testimony of one of Evans's men we captured alive," Takakota explained. "The truth about Willow Creek, about Redding, it is all coming out. The government has launched a full investigation. Justice will be done." He looked at Thomas, a deep gratitude in his eyes. "Our lands will be protected. Our name will be cleared because of you." He then looked at his sister, and his expression softened. "The council has asked Ayana to return. They wish for her to be a teacher, a bridge between our world and yours, to help lead our people into the new future she spoke of." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "And they have extended an invitation to the husband of our new teacher, a hero to our people. There is a home for you here, Thomas McKinnon, if you choose to accept it." With that, he gave them a respectful nod and left the teepee, leaving them alone. Thomas looked at Ayana, his heart full. He saw the question in her eyes. The future they had never dared to dream of was suddenly laid out before them. "A home," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. The word sounded foreign and wonderful. "Our home," Ayana corrected him, her smile radiant. She leaned down and kissed him, a long, slow kiss filled with relief and promise, and a love that had been tested in fire and had emerged stronger than steel. In the quiet warmth of the teepee, surrounded by the people he had once feared, with the woman who was his wife, his partner, his entire world, Thomas McKinnon finally, after a lifetime of running, felt like he had come home. He had ridden into this land looking for peace, and instead found war. But through that war, through the pain and the betrayal and the loss, he had found something so much better. He had found love. He had found a family, and he had found his own redemption. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Building a life between two worlds never is. But as he held his wife's hand, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that they would face it together. And that made all the difference in the world. What a story, right? It just goes to show you that sometimes the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this journey into the Old West, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you want to make sure you don't miss our next adventure, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We've got new stories coming every week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.